Hello, everybody, and welcome to the world's top 20. I am Jatt, joined by PapaSmithy and Deficio. It's the second year the three of us have done this specific list. It's actually live if you want to check out all top 20 players on lolesports.com. Spoiler alert, Uzi is number one since everything's out there.
Damn, you got that out quick, man.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about on this list, right? The fact that we have 5KT players, we have a Danish mid laner on this list. You're going to have to read to find out. There's no way of knowing if he's at Worlds or not, really.
It's true.
Yeah, so you can see actually all of our individual lists here. This is how the list was created. The sum of the list has 7 mid laners, 4 AD carries, 4 top laners, 3 supports, only 2 junglers. It was a really interesting list to make this year.
Yeah, I think if we just look at some of the teams who didn't make Worlds, and therefore some of the players missing, Kingzone obviously used to kind of dominate our top 20 list. We had Prey and Gorilla very high up last year.
4 of the top 6 were from Longzhu Gaming at the time.
BDD, obviously, as well. None of these guys will be on the list because they're not here. SKT not making it, meaning no FLICKR either. So there's a lot of changes, especially in the top, which made it really interesting. Even though we actually ended up getting really close to each other, at least on the top ones.
We really did. We're going to talk about all of those things I mentioned at the top throughout the day. First, though, like we did last year, we do need to talk a little bit about the criteria for the list that we just made. All 3 of us did make lists. We combined those, averaged the numbers. That gives you the official top 20 list that you can find on lolesports.com. But PapaSmithy, what did you do for criteria, and maybe how did it change from last year?
So I think something I did last year that I tried to really play close attention to is to think about, look at the patch, we're on patch 8.19, of course, at this tournament, think about exactly what's going to happen here and where the meta was going, specifically around top lane. I know that when my actual list comes on the screen and when you really zoom in on that one, you see, I think Korean top laners could be a big reason that Korea does have a chance to kind of get away from the RNG favorites tags and have a real chance to get up there. I have 3 Korean top laners in top 10. So looking at kind of expected performance of players at this tournament rather than just purely kind of the best 20 players attending Worlds based on just purely their performance before Worlds was something I zoomed in on as an important criteria for me.
I think also big things, obviously, you have to look at summer split, but also have to remember the entire year. I think at MSI, we learned a lot about certain players that will be on the list, and some will be higher based on MSI performance for sure, and some might not even have made the list based on what we saw there with one of the last big international tournaments we had. But also, historically, there will be some players where you have to factor in how well they've done in the past, and therefore also how high expectations you have for these kind of players going into a tournament like this one.
Yeah, the past performances at Worlds factor in. I do factor a little bit more on recency and how I expect them to do at this tournament, taking into account everything that I possibly can. So for the younger players, there's a level of variance and uncertainty that prevents you from for sure putting them super high. But if we go to, let's say, the top 3 players on the list, and this year's number 1 in Uzi, it's a guy who has performed consistently well at the World Championship. For the last 4 times he's basically been there, right? Multiple finals appearances. He won MSI this year as well. Also won his first LPL championship and is the primary win condition of this RNG team. So this was a unanimous choice for us, but what do you guys think about Uzi in the top 3?
I think it was a very easy number 1. First time we're not having a Korean player there, so an LPL player comes in. And Uzi is just one of the legends of the game, is having that year of Uzi. People have tracked the year, and some people even say it started at All-Star last year when Team China went on to win that tournament. But even if you just focus on 2018 play, he's won every tournament he's attended, and we're even including tournaments that aren't purely RNG, things like Asia Games and things like that, where also he was excelling. So I think for me, it was another year where Uzi's kind of always had this quirk of just being a late game win condition himself because of his amazing team fights, but he's also around his team found a way to fit in his style, but not necessarily always dominate how RNG plays. There's always that looming dread. There's always the late game Uzi win condition, but they're now a much more flexible team with players like Karsa also coming and having a big effect on the team. So I think he's scary in and of himself, but he's also a weapon the team wields kind of smartly in a way that just makes them a real multi-threat team.
And he's also the kind of player where if you do love to hate him, you're kind of running out of things to criticize him
True.
for. Because it used to be things like you never win anything, so therefore you're not like the
How
greatest
could you be
player.
number one if you never won anything?
So that one he kind of killed already this year. Then you could be like, oh, okay, maybe his champion pool sometimes could be issues. Like when Zyra Khan was really hot at the start, he didn't really play it. Took him time to learn it. He's obviously able to play all that kind of stuff now. Okay, maybe Uzi's he greets for farm too much, so you can catch him when he goes for the waves. No, he's actually really smart when it comes to knowing when he can push. So he kind of just keeps getting better, which is actually really impressive. And even if someone like FLICKR had been here, I still think Uzi would be getting the number one spot.
I think that's really interesting to point out because as we were approaching MSI, I was almost a little bit worried that we were overhyping Uzi because there was this hyperbolic level of praise that we were giving him. We're like, every 80 carry in this tournament that are all the best in the region unanimously say that Uzi is the best.
Yep.
This guy is insane.
Reckless is saying in interviews.
And then he did it at MSI, right? So now that we've talked him up, it's just the perfect time to see what happens at Worlds. But I think he's well deserving of number one.
I mean, I was watching that LPL Grand Final that went all 5 games, right, against IG. And that was where Uzi was doing really well. He was like 7-1 while his team was losing around him.
Yeah.
And yet, it didn't feel like the story could end any way other than Uzi carrying. There was just so much certainty for me that even though like the Nexus being attacked, they're being split pushed by Rookie on the Jace, it just felt like it had to end with Uzi winning. And while in the past it was always striving for that first win, now it seems like Uzi winning is just the norm.
Yeah, let's move down just to numbers 2 and 3 because we kind of discussed that as far as the top 3, it does feel like they're a little bit in the class of their own. We did the list first blind before we showed them to each other. And I think all of us were expecting to see Uzi Rookie score 1, 2, 3. Deficio, you put score number 2 and Rookie number 3. PapaSmithy and I both had Rookie number 2. I do want to start with Rookie as the LPL MVP. This is a guy who we've wanted to see at Worlds for a number of years, but he seemed to fall just short year after year, but really had that breakout year in the LPL. IG, the super dominant regular season lane dominant team led by Rookie, only ever losing to RNG in game 5s in both the spring and summer.
And Rookie is that player who, you know, we kind of talked about how Uzi was stripping away the asterisks. I think for most of us, Rookie's been able to do that too. Like, he's always been a player whose high highs was celebrated. He was always the player, much like Skull may get to him, that people wanted to see at Worlds competing with the best in their role. But he's just so mechanically talented. And I think his leadership, and leadership's always very hard to quantify. You're really relying on interviews and his own words. But you can see him leading, but not necessarily the team having to just purely win lane, win game around Rookie only. It used to be, is Rookie hard carrying with 4 kills? Okay, things will fall into place. But now Rookie has been able to kind of share the load on that particular side, but also just be an impressive player who has champions that he innovates, that everyone around the world looks to. He's a name that you talk to mid laners, they always talk about Rookie.
Yeah, and I think with Rookie in the past, there's been criticism towards him in the most important games where he wouldn't carry as hard as he could in some other ones, but typically that's also based on who you're playing against. Like a top team can shut down a single player a little bit easier, but I feel like this year, especially if you look at the best of 5 finally played against RNG, like when this team was down and out, it was Rookie who stood up and was the person who pulled them back into the game, was the person who actually had an individual amazing performance in the mid lane, despite not getting a lot of help from his team. And I think that's where, while we can't judge the leadership based on what he's saying to his team, you can look at who's actually carrying in the biggest games, in the most important moments, and that was Rookie. So I think for me, he was super easy lock for top 3. And the absolute only reason I have him slightly underscore, and it's not even like a step down, it's almost just on the side, is when we are looking at, I looked at 2 things. One, I think Score is the perfect jungler. So to me, that counts a lot for me.
Yep.
And 2, expected performance at Worlds.
I mean, what do you define by perfect jungler?
I think for me, the perfect jungler, like, number 1 strength as a perfect jungler is understanding where to be in the map, which I think is Score's number 1 thing. But then you also need to be able to back that up by having proper mechanics, so you can play all the kinds of different styles. You need to be able to play without winning lanes if your team is not just stomping in the early game. And I think Score has shown now that he can actually do that. Like, me and PapaSmithy had a fun conversation about some of the junglers that Score is actually insane at, which you normally wouldn't expect from a player who's played for now 7-8 years. But like things like Kindred is something where he's just like dominating this champion. Talia being another one. And the fact that he can do that and also play like the normal tanks really well is impressive.
Yeah, Talia is the one that impresses me about Score, because you can say, okay, Score was an AD carry early on in his career, so sure, he'll still be able to carry over some of those marksman mechanics to Kindred. But then Talia is arguably one of his most dominant picks throughout the regular season.
The takeaway with the Talia was more, if you know where to be with a champion with explosive damage, it doesn't matter if you don't hit all your spells. Just start with the Chilling Smite. That one is targeted, the red buff auto attack, and then everything falls into place. But this is just a guy whose emotional storyline, in a year where there's been so many great stories, Griffin, of course, not at Worlds would have been another big story, but his ability to stick and persevere for 15 splits of being one of the best players in two roles, you know, both as an AD carry. He was originally a top laner very much in the early days before even the LCS era in 2012. And then as, you know, this guy who would have walked into our top 20s for years now, but did not make it to Worlds since 2015.
Exactly.
To finally make it and win his LCK split. I was there, of course, casting and having the whole crowd for the first time ever in a match when I was in Korea, singing his name, you know, praising his name. Koreans love a real hard work story that pays off, and him winning in his 16th split was an emotional moment, and now he comes to Worlds. And he's looking to double that trophy case and add a world championship to it.
Yeah, so many experienced players right at the very top of the list in Uzi and Score, guys that have really been there from the start. Zooming out a little bit to the whole list, though, one thing that jumps out is the fact that for the first time, we have 5 players from the same team. So KT has their entire
team,
starting roster on this list. The lowest ranked on KT is UCal. Jumping in at 19, but Score at 3, Smeb at 6, Deft at 12, Mata 13. And then RNG as well has 4 players in the top 20, Uzi at 1, Ming at 8, Karsa at 11, and Xiaohu at 17. But I think the elephant in the room is 2017's list, where we had 4 of Kingzone's players in the top 6.
You think we'd be burned, right?
And you'd say, how could you put so many players from one team so high on the list? And essentially, we've done very similar things with KT and IG. So I know you wanted to talk about this, PapaSmithy. How do you...
I think the thing with KT is they're a team that's always very hard to reconcile when they're losing, because whenever I would cast KT, I'd look at, say, top laner Smeb, you know, the jungler Score, and their support Mata in particular. And these are 3 players where you could make very persuasive arguments. They may be the best players of all time in their roles, and they're still playing, and they've largely been in good form. So whenever they would lose, it's the individual talent here was never in doubt. And the way I looked at KT was, and this will sound harsh, but I think the results have to bear out, they were a team that were put together to win Worlds. That was the thing they talked about, not even to win the LCK. They couldn't even do the first part to get to the events. So they were the less than the sum of their parts. Their parts were uniquely strong. Deft up there in the discussion for AD carry. Pawn, in the end, was replaced by UCal, and I think with UCal, he has unique strengths that make him a fit for the list, but arguing for top 1 mid laner is certainly not there yet. But now, only after Rift Rivals, where they went to Rift Rivals, they didn't lose a game, and we were ready for the meme where they wouldn't make it to Worlds, and then they were undefeated in international games because they won all their Rift Rivals games. But they backed up Rift Rivals, going 8-1, won that big trophy, and now they feel like they're finally leveling up to being the sum of their parts, and that's why they're one of those big favorites for Worlds. But that's also why there will definitely be egg on our faces if KT do struggle at this tournament.
Yeah, I feel like most people who make their own list will struggle not to have at least 4 out of 5 players on a top 20 list. Like, you must, like, Smeb is a guaranteed lock. Score is a guaranteed lock. I think the bot lane as well. Maybe if you don't always like what Deft is doing in game, if you feel like he can be a little
If you
bit
just try to say, is he as good as Deft of 2014,
Right.
2015, you can understand the eye test there. He has a different job now, so it's a
Exactly.
very weird one.
So there's like maybe a small case there to be made. But I mean, for me, I look at the playoffs of LCK and I felt like it was so insanely competitive. Insane runs coming in, obviously, from Griffin, trying to challenge KT in the final. And a big thing for me also when I was thinking about the list was then, okay, with the KT players, okay, how are they going to play in this final? They haven't played in a long time. Are they going to go in and look shaky, struggle to perform in a big game? That's going to be the same then at Worlds. Some of the players might drop down for me, but it was an insane series against them. A lot of the individual players really performed as well. And it kind of just showed to me that, let's say, the depth of old where the choking was a big topic, I don't think that was the situation in that final. And that's why I felt confident putting them in. But if I had to move one out, I mean, Yukal is the lowest one on the list. He is super young still. He is a rookie. And there are definitely some weaknesses that you can then argue, okay, should he be on a top 20 list? But he did just make it in.
Yeah, and I think that there are arguments against Deft being so high or about him being so low, as PapaSmithy mentioned, based on his history. I like the point you brought up about the finals having some of those incredibly clutch fights against Griffin. And overall, the list is just so crowded this year. I do personally think that the teams with the most players on the top 20 are the two favorites for the World Championship. Personally, I have KT as the favorites and then RNG as the second favorites since they are the MSI champions. So that is appropriately reflective of team strength to me. But as you say, teams are often different than the sum of their parts, and teamwork has such a big thing to do with it.
And KT had a really unenviable situation in the final because of the system and the 3-week break we had between semis and final, and the fact that they didn't play in the gauntlet. They came in with more than a month of break. So they actually came in cold to the final. It went to 5 games, they won it. And that is to some degree the credit to the individuals for getting up to the moment because of coming in cold. And now they're coming in cold for Worlds a second time. So while that sounds like the easy defeatist thing for a KT fan to look for excuses, they've shown they can do it once already. They've won the title. So I think for once we can embrace just how powerful the individual players are, but also have the same high expectations about team performance because they are definitely consensus top 3 favorites. Some people have them at 1, some at 2. Gen.G come as defending champions, but KT are definitely a big threat here, but it is still a huge honor to have all 5 players top 20.
Yeah, never been done before in the history of the world's top 20 list.
Please work.
Another person that jumps out as we move down the best players in each role is we unanimously put Kiin as not only the best top laner at Worlds, but we all put him at 4th.
And a fair question for some of our viewers is who? Because Kiin, of course, is the top laner for a Freak of Freaks, but while not a rookie, he debuted in the second half of Summer Split on a different team, Everett Winners. They were relegated, joined Afrika as the replacement for Marin, a name that, of course, our viewers would know very well. And as not an elder statesman, not a big voice of the team, you might have thought, okay, he's going to need time to get going. But this guy, especially in summer, has reminded us that he's a uniquely talented carry player, very, very talented mechanically. In spring season, he actually kind of filled the Marin position and played tank meta. He went over to Asia Games where he was the top laner. I'm not going to get into whether he earned the top lane spot because they did have players from each role and from each of the top teams there, but he definitely played fantastically well at that tournament. Rift Rivals was super competitive. I'm sure you were following those ones when you guys were over in NA. That was a very competitive tournament over in China that they didn't win, but he performed well. So he's already shown some international performance despite the fact, 1 year of pro play.
And I think if you want to compare him to another top laner that was on our list last year, it would be Kiin up in the top lane, who we also had extremely high based on him coming in. A lot of people weren't 100% sure about this guy, and he'd only played, for that 1 year. But I think with Kiin specifically, because he's actually shown he could play different styles at an extremely high level, you get a bit more well-rounded player compared to Kiin, who was very focused on a very specific style. And it's really strange when you watch him, because when I watch carry top laners, I always think to myself, okay, he's going to play on edge 24/7. You can shut him down pretty easily if you just play around his lane, and he will then just continue to give up kills, and he will suddenly be a weakness. But that's just not the case with Kiin. Like, he actually appears to be a really smart player, so mechanically gifted and extremely smart at the same time. And that's why I think he's going to be really hard to deal with for other teams at Worlds. And as we mentioned as well, like with expected performance, like FLICKR, their team is going to be one of those teams that you don't want to face because they are so unique in how they draft and how they play. And a guy like Kiin, I don't think there's a lot of top laners at this tournament who will be able to shut him down.
Exactly. And one of the criteria that we used for this list was importance to the team. And when I look at who was the biggest contributor to FLICKR's success as the number 2 seed out of the LCK, it was Kiin. In the way that they play around him. Some of their success can also be attributed to their unique drafts and their practice regimen and how disciplined they are as a team. But in game, they were always a top side team, and it was almost always Kiin popping off in those games. So that's why I put him at 4th. But of the top 5 or 6, that's technically the riskiest placement I did.
Oh, 100%.
Because we just haven't seen him on the world stage.
But still, you go back to criteria. You're already talking about one. Another criteria we talked about was the patch at Worlds and expected performance. I don't know if you'll necessarily bear this out in the group stage and best of 1, but I think come best of 5s, the Korean top laners, and we all have, in the top 10, the overall ranking is to have Kiin the highest, but also Smeb and Cuvée following it up. I think given the role and the fact that he's performed internationally and the fact that he's around the primary win condition of the team, there's a lot of outside variables and the eye test that all of us, we unanimously put basically a player with 1 year's professional experience, top 5 at Worlds. And I think the flexibility side that Deficio brought up, the fact that he can show the tanks as well, makes it safer than Khan, but it does feel like we're running headfirst into some of the things that were turned on us last year's list.
I mean, there's the famous Dade Award that gets talked about pretty often. And
Explain the Dade.
Yeah, just to quickly explain it. Basically, like the most overhyped player who then ends up not performing, or effectively the most hyped up player who then ends up actually not performing a World, so therefore was overhyped. And obviously it started with Dade specifically.
Elephant in the room.
When he was extremely hyped, I believe it was back in 2013, where he was kind of hyped up as like one of the big players to watch for the entire tournament, and famously everything crashed and burned. But when you put a guy like Kiin number 4, there is a chance, obviously. But again, I think we all have a lot of trust, because I can see a game where he will pull out a carry, and maybe if it doesn't work for one game, he can just go back to a more, tanky pick on his side, and the team can change strategy a bit. And that's why I'm not too scared about Kiin not performing. I also think he has a group where he's not going to be attacked in the top lane, because he's against right now with Flash Wolves, we know. Him versus Wonder is probably going to be
Zeros, though?
DD thing.
Zeros?
I don't think Kiin will struggle there.
I think it's going to be hype, though.
It's going to be hype, but I think he will be able to deal with everything.
All right, so you talked about the Dade Award, right? I'd say in 2016, it would have to go to Clear Love. We had him as 4th, and he had a terrible World.
Yeah.
We never officially crowned a Dade Award for last year, but I think it is a conversation between Khan and Bjergsen.
Agreed.
The Danish mid laner in the top 10. I want to jump there now, actually, to the Danish mid laner in the top 10 named Caps, because here's another player who has been at Worlds before, but pretty unanimously, we all decided to rank him very near the top 10. I had him at 11, Deficio, you had him at 8, and PapaSmithy, you had him at 10. So we're all actually very hyped for this guy, but let's just talk about him, because there is a lot of variance in this placement, as he's a very explosive player.
Yes, I've already made the statement before that I think he's basically the most mechanically gifted player we have ever sent out of Europe. He can do everything in-game when it comes to executing any kind of champion, any kind of matchup, any kind of setup. And he's the kind of player who he plays a lot on feeling, so it's not always the most calculated, but it is very much like, okay, I have a feeling I can make a big play here if I just do this, this, and this, and kind of outplay everyone, and then he will go for it, and it'll actually work most of the time. So he's absolutely insane as a carry. And the thing that's happened with Fnatic this year, which didn't happen last year, is the team have learned if you just play around Caps in the early game, then he will never fall far enough behind to not have an impact. And that was kind of the problem for him a year ago when he was a rookie. He would just continue playing super aggressive. Then the enemy jungler would show up and kill him a few times, and he would basically do nothing in the game. It does not happen anymore. He's a smarter player. The team plays around him. He is the star player on Fnatic. It's not reckless. It is really all about Caps. And because his performance at MSI, especially in the group stage, was so strong, and in my opinion was the best out of the mid laners, I'm not scared that he can't perform against international players, which is always one of the big questions when you have a hyped up Western player.
So we have him overall, if you look at the list on the screen now, at rank number 9. There's other mid laners though, and the thing is, while I agree with all the points, and MSI definitely jump-started his international reputation, the interesting point to me was comparing him to a player like Kuro, for example, who's ranked 16 on this list, and thinking about, is Caps significantly better or significantly unique compared to Kuro? And definitely in playstyle it is, but it's so hard to quantify things like who is better than another player when they're so different. Like Kuro, to me, is the very stable player with a huge champion pool who's not looking to make those individual plays and not tasked to make.
You can have the huge champ pool part of Caps as well.
True, absolutely. And Nuke Duck and EU mid laners got their champ pools. But the reason why I bring it up is when I really sat down, I really had to think about, is Caps significantly better than Kuro? And I had to think about his role and the fact that Caps is tasked to do so much. And that Fnatic is a team expected to do well. And they pivoted from a reckless style to a Cap style. And it seemed to pay off in spades. But kind of my ending takeaway with, say, Kuro versus Caps. This is a mental exercise because people will tell me, Kuro had a great spring season. He had a great first half of the summer season. I came into Rift Rivals saying, this player is our best performing mid laner. And of course, that raised the ire of a lot of people over that sample size he fit there. But after Rift Rivals, Kuro fell away a little bit. His performance after Rift Rivals and into playoffs, he wasn't the pivotal star. You talked about Kiin's Spirit was the god of the run they had as well. But the way I kind of take it away, kind of the way I reconcile it is, to me, they're just, I need an analogy. And the analogy I have is the Caps for sure fits into the sports car. If you're going to do a car analogy, he's the red sports car. It goes very fast, makes the big plays, and some teams need that in the mid lane. Absolutely, that is something that is very important. But Kuro, who's never been that sort of player, he has evolved past, being a very secondary player to someone like FLICKR. He has become a lot more clutch in big games. So I actually think of Kuro now, if we're going to keep the car analogy going, as kind of like the classic Bentley, this antique car that's very elegant. If you say which is the better car, the 1970s Bentley or this fast sports car from 2018, there's no way to consensus know which one is truly better, but they fit different roles. I just feel like Caps' role and being that number one star of his team elevates him above.
And that's the big thing. I feel like a lot of the Western hope is on Fnatic, and within Fnatic, specifically Caps. You look at even the European LCS MVP vote, and he was nearly unanimously the MVP in the EULCS on a team with Reckless, who has historically been the face of that franchise. So you have to be such an explosive player to supplant that as a brand. I mean, obviously Reckless was not playing for like over half of the split, but that just shows how strong of a player Caps was with everything working around him, with how many solo kills he was able to pulling out, with how many different champions he was able to pull. There is still a lot of uncertainty with the pick because we're not too far removed from 2017, or even though he had a very impressive MSI, he still had the most deaths in the tournament. So he is still a high variance player, but we talked a lot about Caps, Western hope there in number 9. And I wanted to just double back on our role discussion a little bit, because we've talked about the best AD carry and Uzi, the best mid laner, and Rookie, the best jungler and scorer, best top laner and Kiin. But the best support is something where we actually had a little bit of a disagreement. Sword Art is the highest ranked support on our list, but personally, I had Ming as my highest ranked support, the support for RNG, and then Mata was my third one. But let's talk about the supports for a little bit, starting with Sword Art, the highest ranked support on our list.
Yeah, Sword Art has basically become Flash Wolves. Like back a couple of years ago, it was a lot about the Maple Karsa show.
Triangle.
These kind of things. And then you added Sword Art to it and it was like a triangle, but still like the guys who got hyped up were the mid lane and the jungler. With Karsa gone, obviously, now he's been gone for a while. Maple, while he's still a great mid laner, is no longer, for me at least, the big superstar. It is really Sword Art. Everything this team will do right now is going through the bottom lane. It's going through Sword Art specifically, because when you get an advantage on bot side, he's enabled to actually leave the bottom lane as well. You will get roams to mid lane. You're going to get invades, great deep vision. And he's also he's the kind of player when he's not playing, the team literally just falls apart. Like, they do not know what to do in the game. So you can clearly see the importance he's bringing. And that is actually why I put him the highest for me. It's just the importance Sword Art brings to a Flash Wolves team that I think will perform at Worlds. His individual play and a meta where we're going to have engaged supports, which is basically Sword Art.
And it's important you mentioned the last point, because I want to pat myself on the back and talk about how last year I had him top 10 as well. I'm like, Sword Art, this is his time. Engaged supports. Was a little bit too slow on the Ardent Sensor meta, kind of mucking up my working there, so I kind of had to rip up the math on that one. But I agree with you. There was a couple of games at the end of the season where we saw Flash Wolves without Sword Art, and we're not going to see that again. We're definitely going to see Sword Art in all the games. This time we know there is no dominant reason foreseeably for there to be an enchanter meta that's all about something like Ardent Sensor. So there will be Alistair, which of course has been his legendary pick for the longest time. So I think now everything comes together where Sword Art finally wins that MVP over in the LMS. He's performing. The meta seems to fit him. The gap between the other two supports we'll get to is not massive, but I think he deserves his spot as number 1.
Yeah. I had Sword Art as number 9, Deficio 7, PapaSmithy number 9. The larger variance was me with Ming at 6, Deficio at 10, and PapaSmithy at 12. And I'll start with Ming here, the support of Uzi. And I've seen Uzi play with so many different supports, and it's always hard to decouple the success of a dominant bot lane between the AD carry and support. But I actually thought we got a few opportunities to do that this year. Uzi was taking large blocks of time off to rest some injuries, and I thought Ming was just as dominant in those games. Additionally, when we saw the Asia games, they had Mako and Ming in that tournament, and the difference when those two were in, I thought was pretty drastic. So when I watch Ming, he does have the ability to play the super supportive Uzi babysitter, but he also has the ability to turn that aggressive edge. So it's one of the most versatile supports I think Uzi has ever played with. And as referenced by the championships, Uzi has shown some growth, but I think Ming has been a perfect pair for him, which is, as the best bot lane in the world, I had to put that support very high.
But it was so hard to decouple Ming. Like, I knew Ming was making my top 20, but thinking about where he would fit when I was really thinking about the list at the start was so tricky, because he has both the confounding variable of being next to Uzi, who's having the year of all years, and also the fact that he actually got that relationship going with Uzi, because Uzi, of course, famously, at least in the start of his career, went through a lot of supports that just didn't fit with him. That was actually also a badge of honor that has worked out. But I'm with you, Jatt. I also think of Asia games as well, where he brought back Gragas support. So I had been talking to Korean supports about Gragas support before, because we knew the jungle was coming in there. And people were saying, can't run it. 2v2, it's too weak. He came out in Asia games, was running Kai'Sa Gragas lanes and making the 2v2 work in what appeared on paper to be an unplayable lane by Korean standards. And then you talk to the same Korean supports and like, actually, this Gragas support thing's working out. So he's been able to be innovative. He's been able, like Jatt said, to cycle between Abel, who actually reminds me of Uzi from 2012, 2013, 2014 in terms of looking for the outplayer rather than making the controlled move, right back to Uzi and not skip a beat. So Ming definitely deserves plenty of praise.
I think he's the most well-rounded support we have in the world right now.
I have to think about that point, but that's an interesting one.
I mean, that's for me because he is actually able to play all these different styles. Like if we have now Sword Art, Mata, and Ming as the 3 guys on our list, and let's just pretend we swapped into an Ardent Sensor meta, all of a sudden I would be most comfortable in Ming, actually maintaining the best performance. So yeah, Uzi helps there, but I think it's actually impressive how much growth he has made as a player specifically. Because I remember when I just started watching him play with Uzi, I was just like, so another one of those supports, might only be here for a couple of games, who knows, and it's just about Uzi anyway. But actually, I think now the pairing in itself, Ming has shown that he is able to hold his own and almost be equal to Uzi when it comes to the importance of the bottom lane in the laning phase, at least.
Yeah. Let's talk briefly about Mata as well, just because he's the player who has been here the longest, right? He is the world champion
biggest name
on the list, a huge name, but he's had a fairly up and down career since then, making it back to Worlds now in KT Rolster.
And that's I love that you pointed out once again, because I feel like today is all about like elephants in the room and kind of dispelling old myths and old groupthink about players. Mata is not on this list for name value. This is a guy who has performed exceptionally well this year. I would say last year was kind of dominated with just playing defensively around Deft, and KT were very Deft focused in 2017. But it's been, honestly, both his Tom Kench games this season that have been important, and he's had some choice interviews about why he played
Mata
Tom Kench. Making up for the mistakes of his teammates, of course. Mata always has a way with words. But more importantly, he has taken champions like Shen that you also think mostly about the defensive usage of the ulti, and won games with Taunt Flash, has been super, super assertive when he needs to be. The famous Doublelift interview of how could he dare flash on me as Alistair is as relevant on a champion like Shen, who's not even thought of as an engaged support out of lane. So the fact that he can still have so much brilliance, so much quintessential Mata that propelled him to 2014 World's MVP is why he's here, not the fact that he is a famous name.
100%. And that's kind of a crazy thing, because you mentioned already the ups and downs. Like when he went to China and played.
He played with Uzi. He was one of Uzi's supports.
And we got to see a player that, for some reason, forgot everything in terms of how you actually play any champions that requires mechanics. Like watching him try and make big plays on Thresh, where he like steps forward in lane and like blindly tries to hook someone and just dies in lane. Like that was not the Mata you knew from before he actually left Korea. And it was really sad to see the downfall of one of the legendary supports we have in the game. But then seeing him really return, especially this year, it's actually been an amazing story to follow, because there were so many issues as well with KT beforehand, internal issues as well, and figuring out who was the leader and all that kind of stuff. But it seems now that things are clicking, and Mata specifically is looking fantastic individually.
A small fun fact, something to look for the viewers at home and you guys as well, is Mata very rarely, when he plays Thresh, uses his Samsung white skin that he has for that, of course. And the reason, he was actually interviewed and they said, why do you never use your skin? And he said, well, I don't think my performance has been good enough to justify using it. He used it once. It's fun how little things like that, if he does play Thresh and he shows the Samsung white skin at this tournament, that will show you that he's like ready to go, that he's reared up and he's looking to once again be the player that was on everyone's lips after 2014.
Wow, that's going to be something cool to look for. Again, looking at the whole list, 9 LCK players, 7 LPL players, 2 LMS players, Maple's in the clump of mid laners that we're going to talk about in a bit, but also 1 NA player and 1 EU player. We've already talked about Caps. Doublelift sneaks in again at number 20.
Always finds a way.
And I assure you, it's not like there's some giant Riot conference room that says we must have 1 NA player, put him 20th, because a lot of people will point to last year as a reason that maybe Doublelift should be excluded from this list.
Purely on Worlds performance. He had a better Worlds, but definitely top 20 felt like a reach.
Yeah, he had a flash meme at Worlds that he was still saving it until this moment, Worlds 2018. But really, I would say from an international performance perspective, his MSI was actually pretty solid, which is why I was a little bit more confident moving him into the bottom of the list again. And actually, last year he squeaked in the list as well, but I think Doublelift is a better player and had a better year than last year, and the list is actually more crowded this year, as we've talked about, with 5 KT players and 4 RNG players, winning his first North American LCS MVP, winning both splits spring and summer as the primary carry on that team, as well as having a pretty good MSI, is enough to at least make me push aside some of those past world championship failures in the short term.
I mean, my biggest concern for Doublelift is not really Doublelift himself. It's actually the people around him, especially Ole down the bottom lane. I feel like still there's a lot of things that will probably get exposed against some of the world-class bot lanes you're going to face at Worlds. And that problem as an AD carry, obviously, is if your team starts falling behind, typically it's very hard for you to have a strong enough individual performance to actually look really good and pull ahead. He tried that at MSI, which is also why he deserves to be high or at least like near a top 20 or just in a top 20. but I can see a world where he will struggle, but not because of his own play, which could then, make people question why he's on the list.
Still, it's a little bit of a badge of honor to me, like when it comes to his maturity, because obviously he's a player that's been around a very long time, but there was, of course, MSI and Ole excusing himself and then coming back into the team and much publicized just rifts between him and specifically his support. And yet I could always decouple that when I came and looked at the performance. I never thought, oh, is this some sort of feuding? Because I thought Doublelift was remarkably consistent in his performance in spite of the issues that 3 years ago, I'm sure would have spiraled in a different way. So I have a lot of respect for Doublelift for growing up. And while the leader term is put out there a lot, he understands exactly how important he is to that team, and especially that success in North America. And with Deficio, I think replicating that success, if he was able to do that, would super enhance his reputation, because there's the fact that they're so playing around Doublelift, I think, is going to be a bit of an issue for them at this World Championship. But purely in terms of his performance, I think we're going to get very strong performance from Doublelift.
Yeah, and just so we can close out on the North American and EU players on the list, Caps and Doublelift, some exclusions of players that were potentially close to the top 20. Deficio, you want to start this off?
Yeah, I think if you look at G2, Perks is obviously not on the list. I think during the year, if you were to make a top 20 list, there would definitely be moments where you had him guaranteed.
Funnel meta.
Funnel meta for sure.
How high does he get there? If this is a funnel worlds, we're talking easily top 10.
Yeah, I mean, then he's obviously on the list. I think during spring, he also had some great moments where you could argue for Perks being on the list. I think the summer split after Funnel disappeared obviously was a big issue for G2, for everyone who's followed them in Europe. They did bounce back in the Gauntlet run, and Perks did play really well individually. So once again, kind of for me, I started having this debate with myself, is he on my list or not? Now, this was obviously locked a bit. I think we were like 1 day into play-ins or something, and then the list had to be locked. But I decided to put him just outside, mainly just based on the fact if I look at the full year itself, it's hard for me to justify him over some of the other guys on the list right now. But I think at Worlds, he is a strong mid laner, but I can't put him top 20.
Yeah, and I think so much of it, when we talked about criteria at the start, was projecting success at Worlds. So when I look at a guy, you mentioned Perks, I look at Someday, is a player who in previous years was seen as one of the best top laners in the world, and he was voted the best top laner in the North American LCS. But when we have the North American LCS MVP with a large percentage of the votes and Doublelift getting placed at 20, and then we're looking at Someday on 100 Thieves walking into the World Championship, I couldn't justify moving him into the top 20, especially when the team doesn't play around him very well. He doesn't have the tools to necessarily solo carry the game and have that work in an impressive looking way. So you can't decouple that and place a player in top 20 because you say, his situation might just not be right, because it's about how you perform at the World Championship. And for Someday, that fell just outside the list for me.
And I'm so excited to watch him because he left Korea with, top 3 in Korea, top lane status. I think Smeb had supplanted him by the time he left, but he was right up there. He was an MVP a year before he left. But going over to North America have had strong top lane players, but I think no one's really had consistent top lane performance in North America in the last couple of years. I just want to see him again on the world stage with some quality opposition and just see where Someday's at, because that's the part that's not clear to me, because we know that his best is definitely top 20 potential.
Yeah, and just to mention 2 other players who didn't make the list. Some people ask about Wonder, especially after play-ins. But as we said before here, we did have to lock this before we got to watch most of his games. But that performance in itself suddenly makes Wonder a person you can start discussing. How close should he be? But based on everything we've seen during the year, I think there were some highs from Wonder, but also a lot of times where we didn't get to see him shine too much, even though he's always done well for himself. And the last one, I'm probably actually the biggest Western name missing, I guess, for a lot of fans will be Reckless.
Right.
And this is obviously interesting because last year...
You're already smirking, so...
Yeah, well, last year we had a big discussion around Doublelift versus Reckless going into Worlds, who is the better player. Fnatic played around Reckless a lot. They relied on him to kind of be the big carry.
We had that discussion going into MSI as well.
Right? So it's always a discussion that's often there. But this year here, two things for me is actually why Reckless is not on my list, or actually not even close to my top 20 right now. One is MSI itself. I felt like Reckless came in at a very, very high level from Europe, and he was the MVP for the second time in a row. But during MSI, specifically against the very best bot lanes and the very best AD carries, the Fnatic bot lane fell apart, and Reckless individually didn't get to have the impact he wanted, which was disappointing. And then, of course, in Summer Split, where he doesn't end up playing for half the regular season, when he returns, it wasn't about him, it was about Caps, until the final itself against Schalke, where they started playing more for late game once again, and we started seeing more of the old Fnatic style, where they did rely on Reckless, and he did perform in the final. I will definitely give him that credit, but that was not enough for me to put him on this top 20 list, and that's why he's not on it.
All right, got the honorable mentions for the Western players. We also haven't touched on the defending world champions who are on this list.
Right.
Ruler, actually, at number 5, and Cuve, just to catch me right, is docking in at number 10. These are two very interesting players to talk about, because Ruler actually moves in as the number 1 AD carry in the LCK, which a lot of people who wouldn't have followed this 2018 season would think, what is that? Like, Ruler, at least for Samsung last year, was very much a role player type of person, but here you can see 33% of his team's damage. And PapaSmithy, talk about what he means for this Gen.G team.
I mean, he means everything. It sounds like aggrandizing him, but literally, I cannot remember a Gen.G game where Ruler played bad and the team won. No, not even a single best of 1 where that happened. Now, while he's not necessarily been the hard carry in all their wins, if he wasn't performing, they were losing. They were the only team in summer in a meta where we had Vladimir bot lane, Yasuo bot lane, a lot of crazy bot lanes. He was the last of the AD carries. He played AD carry the entire time, and that was really hard. You know, you saw him stringing together very shoestring builds just to survive. Like, need a Vamp Scepter here, a Hex Drinker there. Please, God, I need some more items. But he was consistent whenever he played very well. The team did well, and he really grew into their linchpin.
Yeah.
No, everyone's eyes were always on Ruler and no one else. And you also bring up Cuve, who also makes top 10. He is the antithesis of Ruler in that it's very much about his peaks when he came into the World's Gauntlet, this gauntlet buff that Samsung Galaxy had for 2 years.
He knows
now
when to
Gen.G has
perform.
inherited.
Yeah.
When this man is looking to miss out on Worlds, something changes. And the meta also plays into this, but we know that Worlds performance for Cuve and regular season performance for Cuve, even playoffs for Cuve, are very different things. He is just a player that when Worlds is on the line, he is there.
More so than any other player on this list, for me, Cuve is here because of his past performances in international events, not because of his domestic regular season play.
Nope.
Because he is the most
He's not even a top 40 player if we're including regular season.
He's just a guy who sits in the top lane and you're like, meh, every single time. But
you're sad, Jatt, because you remember the games. You're like, where is World?
He's actually extremely frustrating to watch because of that.
But listen, it's now 2 world championships in a row where he's shown up. Like, he's a big reason this team has made runs back-to-back into the finals when they lost to SKT in 2016 and when they beat them in 2017. So he has to be moved up there. I actually had him lower than you guys do. I have him at 14. Deficio, you have him at 9. PapaSmithy, you have him at 8.
Top lane meta, baby.
It's just so hard for me to still look past, like, oh yeah, but even if he's not that great in regular season, he's going to be great at Worlds, but there's still that part of you that knows you have to respect that potential of being able to flip a switch and turn it on when it matters most.
I just think both Papa and I, we look at the highs and we expect the highs, you know, when we see Cuve going into this kind of tournament. Like, he was the best top laner in the world last Worlds. Even though people were talking about Huni and Kiin, like, it ended up being Cuve. And that's always the thing I've actually loved about the guy is we never hype him up as the carry top laner that you must play around and that will just take over the game on his own. But he ends up being able to match the carry top laners with carries himself. But then he's also a great tank player. He knows exactly where to be on the map. And that's kind of the fascinating thing about a name that so often will get ignored a little bit when talking about the great top laners.
Yeah.
And every time we do that, it's always Cuve at the end. We're like, oh, that guy was insane.
In so many sports, greatness is defined by a high level of play over a long period of time. right? But Cuve's long period of time is these 1 month bursts at the end of
So
years.
would you say he's a clutch player? Because that's
Basically,
what it's
definitely.
proving to be when it comes to seasons. Also, coming back to honorable mentions for a moment, another player who had an insane peak at the end of the season, but whose regular season's performance actually gate-kept him out of the list by 1, is Spirit, who really was kind of our 21st player, the player most likely to make it to the list who didn't get there. This guy and the playoffs and the gauntlet that a FLICKR ran all the way to the semifinals, 1 game away from making to the grand final. Spirit brought out the Predator Gragas. He was the first to show that and had just this amazing run of performance that reminded you of the best of Spirit. And that was not quite enough to carry him to the list. He's the 3rd best jungler, and we only had 2 on the top 20, which may actually prove to be a big thing with Lee Sin and other big junglers potentially dominating this tournament. But Spirit was so damn close.
I put him on my top 20 list, basically, because of his gauntlet run.
All right.
There was really so little else I could actually hold on to, but just knowing how well he's going to perform. But I just want to stay real quick on Gen.G or Samsung, because there are 2 names that obviously ended up winning Worlds, and we had them on our list last year, Crown and Ambition.
Yeah.
They're not on the list this time.
Right.
They're not even close. Especially Crown is not even
Crown
close
didn't
right
play
now.
the majority of the summer split. They actually played with Fly for most of it and only brought Crown in at the end.
And they did bring him in at the end, right? So you can make an argument there for him ending up stepping up when
I'd
it
actually
really
have
mattered.
Crown above Ambition, who, of course, was the highest priced jungler we had last year. But it really felt like right now, obviously, tanks are being phased out. So we know that there's probably going to be pretty low emphasis on tanks at this tournament. So you could say meta doesn't suit him. But even when the meta was more towards his side earlier in the season, he wasn't really close to any level of past performance. So he's another player who, of course, was the crowning star of the Rise music video, right? Like, this is a guy whose story is so well known, but his name is nowhere near enough to propel him to top 20.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention because it is, a very, very big name that we're leaving out. Crown specifically, we're expecting a lot of more supportive picks.
Malzahar's back, baby.
Malzahar, like his Lissandra, obviously was pretty huge when it really mattered here in the Gauntlet run for him. Which, again, while you can say Lissandra is not a supportive pick specifically, but what he can do really well with it is the lockdown, is the ability to actually roam and make plays. So Crown is going to be basically on the team to try and get Ruler and Cuve.
Well, it's important to note that the type of play that Samsung had last year, even if they're bringing the same players to Worlds a year later, the type of play is different, and the focus of the team is on different players, with Ruler being the main focus this year.
And I think actually during Worlds, we got to see this transition happen already.
Ardent Sensor, of course.
Ardent Sensor was the big part, but like in the end, it was a lot around Ruler specifically in the bottom lane. Like he would win every lane with Core JJ, and these guys would just kind of be able to take over games. And if that happened, you just couldn't beat Gen.G. That was obviously a big story, and it kind of remained true for 2018. And that's also why Ruler is so high on this list, even though he might stand out right now.
Yeah, and something that's very interesting about this list that we haven't touched on yet is the fact that we have 5 mid laners, all one after the other, from 15 to 19. Maple, Kuro, Xiaohu, Scout, and Yucal. And it's also interesting how we have fairly drastically different opinions on all these mid laners. I have Maple at 20, Deficio has him at 14, PapaSmithy at 13, but then you'll take a player like Xiaohu, who I have at 12, Deficio has at 21, and PapaSmithy has at 19, yet somehow...
You didn't have him top 20?
Spirit took his spot, man.
Yet somehow they've compressed all into this clump of mid laners who have different styles. So you already talked a little bit about Kuro. I think we should start this one with the one that ended up having the highest aggregate rank, and that's Maple.
Yeah, so Maple, it's actually weird because Maple was easy to put on the list based on history, based on the fact that 2018 has been a bounce back year for him when 2017 was definitely not a good year for Maple specifically. He is still this extremely mechanically gifted mid laner, but he's also a lot smarter in how he plays. He can play the more defensive style, he can play the more aggressive style. Like, he's very well rounded in that sense, but he's not, the one player you have to look at on Flash Wolves right now. Like, it's actually a lot more about the bottom lane itself. So when I look at my list, like Mabel is probably the one player I could actually move around the most based on that, because I think a player like Betty is not on, even though he's so important. But I think Mabel deserves to be on a top 20 list.
This is the first time that he's actually made the
He's
top
always been
20.
like 21.
Isn't that insane that he's been a bubble boy, you know, right around 21, 22 for a very long time?
But it's also because we have not expected too much from Flash Rules at Worlds.
That's part of it. Last year, I would say my kind of deflating factor for Maple, why I didn't have him right up there, was his regular season performance last year. I think did fall away a bit.
It did,
Karsa was still on the roster, but Maple was the one whose performance had gone down the most relatively. He's had a much stronger year this year. I agree with you. And Betty's another name that I think Betty's role in the team has really allowed him to have a little bit less burden, because Betty's had a really good year and has been able to
Definitely an honorable
take
mention.
up the mantra of carry. But Maple's just a classy player who performed very well at MSI. It's remembered as a Caps tournament, and yet Maple was, for a lot of it, right up there with Caps in terms of mid laners at that tournament. So I have no problem having Maple very high. I think the most interesting one, and kind of the biggest meme for us in producing last year, was Scout, who's also in this group here, because Scout is a player that flattered to deceive.
Tell us about last year, Jatt.
Because Jatt, you were super on the hype train for Scout last year.
And now you've seen the light, as you've obviously
we've seen the light.
top
That's
20
right.
Between 17,
There's been a
18, and
sample
17.
of 100 games since then.
One of the most unanimous top mid laners we've had on this list, actually, all within one ranking of each other. So Scout became a more consistent player for me this year, still having a lot of the high highs and having fewer of the low lows. Like I said, this is a more crowded list than last year, so even though his ranking comes in about the same as last year he ended up aggregating to 19, this year he's at 18, I think he is a better player now as pretty much the primary carry for this EDG team, who often play around him, and his champion pool is bigger than it was last year as well.
I think last year he really was, you know, double-edged sword, whichever meta we want to use. He had very poor games. Even at Worlds, he famously had games where you had segments where he was showing the fact that he wasn't respecting vision and junglers.
It was like, if you stop the game after 10 minutes, people could make an argument for Scout being one of the best mid laners at the tournament, because he would be like 3-0 up in lane and having solo killed people left and right. And then if you run the next 10 minutes of the game, people would be like, what's happening? This is like the worst thing you can ever do. You throw away everything.
But this year, he has been able to basically cut out, not necessarily 100%, but we're talking 90+% of those real brain fades, or like just so zero focused on outplay into consistent play. And he also he's one player where one game really dominates my kind of desire to see him top 20, because I remember at Rift Rivals when they played EDG, and he had one of the hardest carry performances, EDG versus FLICKR. He had one of the most hard carry performances I've ever seen on the Zoe in the mid lane. Of course, the champion, very powerful, but he literally won a game purely from a solo kill in the mid lane, spreading his lead to top and bot. And that was just much more of Scout. There were none of the... He would have at least 3 games like that last year that deflated my opinion, but I remember that game and I remember his consistency, and that's why I have no problem with him being entrenched top 20.
He's a star player on EDG now.
Yeah.
Not the case last year, in my opinion.
Sure.
Well, that was last year.
Yeah.
We're on to 2018
We
now.
are.
Another player we had a disagreement on this year actually is Xiaohu, who, as far as consistency goes, to me, has been remarkably consistent. And as the #1 team out of the LPL, here's a player that last year was actually much higher on our list. He was number 5, higher than Uzi, actually, because I thought in a lot of games they were specifically playing around Xiaohu. Whereas now, they are almost always just playing around Uzi. His kills are way down. He's more so on wave clear champions that are then playing around the rest of the map. But to me, he still has the ability to carry if he is called upon, which is why I couldn't move him as far down the list as you two did.
So I have to disagree on the consistency part. I actually think the inconsistencies has plagued him a lot in 2018, which is one of the reasons I put him just outside my top 20 list. I think there's been too many games where targeting him early on has actually been successful. I think there's been games where he's been necessary as a carry and he hasn't been able to do it for his team. I definitely agree that on things like Rise, he's actually performed very well consistently, but that's very limited for me. I don't think right now, because the team play so much around bottom side. I don't think Xiaohu is as important. You already mentioned it, where last year we had him number 5, and last year he was like insane in the summer split. Like it was just like the Xiaohu show, basically. But he, even at Worlds, ended up not being the main guy that played around. Again, Ardent Sensor, obviously Uzi was a big deal there, but I think for me, putting Xiaohu outside is one of those that might end up hurting.
Because you technically had him at 21, so we would have been outside here.
Yeah, so he was just outside, right? Because I know he's individually good enough to be a top 20 player. I just don't see it enough from him in 2018. I think he can do it, but I think for me, with such a tight group of players, he was the guy who had to drop out.
He had the keys to the castle in 2017 summer, for sure. This was the guy everyone looked at. He was the carry. But then Ardent Sensor came in, and in hindsight, it would have dropped his rank if we had known. And we did place less of an emphasis last year. And obviously, the Ardent Sensor thing was a late development. But this year, I'm kind of halfway between you two in that he's kind of been forced to change his role for sure. He knows he is not going to be. It is the Uzi show at the end of the day, so he's been forced to hand in the keys to the castle. He understands, and it's the teething problems of that's a very big mindset change to go more towards the wave clear, the utility, to have a different role, and then situation to be asked to step up. It's all about what you're scrimming and what you're practicing and what mindset you're in. It's been a different mindset. His performance has dropped, and I do think he's going to largely be playing Karma, Rise, much more about utility and wave clear. So that's why I don't have him top 20. But I'm not surprised if he does show up and become a top 10 player. He earned his ranking last year. I think he earns, for me, top 20. But because of my expected role I'm going to see from Xiaohu, it's much lower than his high highs of last year.
Yeah, moving more closely towards the end of the list, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss TheShy, the top lane.
He's on there.
For IG.
Yeah.
He is on the list. I have him 10, Deficio 15, PapaSmithy 16. And it's a player who had such high highs, specifically actually in some of the spring splits.
Oh, yes.
When it was almost all TheShy and a little bit of Duke. But then a lot of kind of mystery surrounding his injury in the spring playoffs. They then lost with Duke against RNG.
And Duke played most of summer.
That was a big upset in the time. And Duke did play slightly over half the games in the summer split. And even some of the games when they're playing best of 5. So they're bringing both of these top laners to Worlds. But when this team is at their best for IG, it is both TheShy and Rookie completely outclassing their lane opponent. And the reason I don't have him higher is because of that unknown factor. I don't think he's at the level he was at towards the end of the spring split. I'm not willing to say that he can't get there, but he's one of those players that we haven't seen at Worlds before, is another very high variance player, tons of talent, but I can't honestly say that I know he's going to perform at Worlds.
Before, when I was first thinking about top 20, because of the summer and because of the fact that he couldn't be clutch in spring, he wasn't even going to hit the list for me, probably. He would have been kind of a 23. But then I'm sure he's a player who logged on. He's like, oh, it's the Worlds patch. What's going on here? And saw the fact that it seems very likely that something like Darius is going to become a bigger pick. Didn't see too much in play-ins, but I think Darius and Fiora's situation will be in there. Jace will be played more by the 1-3-1 teams, and that is Invictus Gaming to a T. The meta starts to whirl towards these carry top laners, and I think he will definitely be playing plenty of games. The kind of interesting point, just zooming back to the Dade Award for a moment, is if he was very high on this list, he'd be another candidate, right?
Yeah.
But actually, one of his disqualifying factors is if he has a bad game, you can always see Duke play. So it's going to be hard for him to have actually an extended bad performance to the point where you could actually award something. But given the patch, that's why I reinflated and put him back on the list, because this guy is exquisitely talented. For sure, another one of these Riven one tricks who've been able to really make things happen on other champions and into professional play. He could certainly be the unsung hero of Worlds.
I mean, he would have been so high on the list if we made it after spring.
Oh yeah,
Like he would have been competing against someone like Kiin, Smep up there towards the top.
Still
of the
Kiin in
standings.
spring season, obviously.
Kiin as well, right? It's actually funny because when you talk to the LPL analysts after spring split, they were all basically sad that IG didn't get to show up at. They're like, come on, we needed TheShy IG in playoffs
to beat Korea.
We need to show this new top laner that appeared, who is such a talent, basically, and can just win games on his own, which is so hard for a lot of top laners to do. But in summer, especially now when you talk to the same analysts, a lot of them will actually say that IG looked better with Duke, which is weird because TheShy was so much better in the spring split. But I think a lot of it still comes down to how Duke can play with the rest of the team. And obviously then it becomes a lot more about just Rookie alone, which then also made Rookie even more important for the team. But
get him on Fiora. Doesn't need to play with the rest of the team.
Yeah, I'm sure. But I think I mentioned Mabel before was one of the players I could move up and down the most, I feel like, on my list. I probably have to change that actually to TheShy right now. If you ask me a couple of games into the group stage, I might be like, TheShy is not even on my top 20 list. I might be like, hang on, this guy, get him further up.
And I think so much of the placement just goes down to how good we think IG is going to be at Worlds, right? Because how good are they going to perform?
And how much is he going to play?
Who is more excited about IG than I think you are, which is one of the reasons I had Shy bumped up. Because if they're able to play their lane dominant, just I am better than you style and get 5,000 gold ahead by 15 minutes, they're going to be very successful at the World Championship, and TheShy is a big part of it.
I'm going to try to once again be the peacemaker. Cool your jets, both of you. What I'll say is, when it comes to IG especially, let's say we had our top 20 as movable between games. We had an interactive one we can move up and down. TheShy is the sort of player who's going to start at 60, and then 3 best of ones later, he's at number 1. And then a best of 5 comes around and he's off the list.
It's possible.
Let's say, I think this year especially, we're saying this is a list that we can look back on fondly after the tournament. I think after the group stage, it might once again be, okay, but what about all these players who do well? Let's just not promise any lists right now. But all I'm trying to say is,
this is live.
Even at the end of 6 best of ones, I don't think this list is really fully formed and really fully fixing its purpose. But my impression is that this list will be looking good coming back to it after the World Championship.
I'm just still going to say, we don't even know if Duke is going to play the vast majority of some of these games.
Yeah. Or Karsa, a jungler we have very high on the list for RNG.
I got him real high.
MLXG could also play a lot of those games, but we just have Karsa.
Don't want to see that.
As a, I mean, Karsa's the guy they bring in best of 5s. It feels like the guy that they really want for the rest.
Also
of the
using
team.
him a lot more now.
We got to see he played all 4 games in the MSI final for their championship. They used him a lot more throughout the regular season. It feels like they bring in MLXG if they need a change of pace, but Karsa is the dominant one. Interestingly enough, actually, Ning was voted the first team jungle, the IG jungler, for the LPL awards. But when we're taking into account international experience, track record, consistency, we rank Karsa higher.
It's very true. And Ning is basically Scout of last year.
Yeah.
Where one game you're like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen. He's 10-0 killing everyone. And the next game he makes the worst, dumbest plays you've ever seen.
Most kills and most deaths of all LPL junglers. And they have 14 teams in the LPL.
That says enough.
He's the most jungler.
So that's why he's not on our
Ning,
list.
not Karsa.
You know, like there's a lot of stuff that can happen when Ning plays, and he will be actually a fun player to follow. But there's too many bad moments for Ning to be on my list, at least. Karsa, however, I think Karsa is the best jungle choice for RNG. I think he makes the team a lot more consistent. He doesn't have to make these big crazy outplays. He seems like just a smarter player overall. He works really well together with all the laners. It's not about playing around Karsa specifically, which you sometimes have to do with MLXG because he kind of forces that kind of style from you with some of the picks he can use. Karsa plays a lot more just around the team specifically.
But his pop-off champions are back. Lee Sin, I think, will be big.
That's why he's the second highest ranked jungler.
And that is just another thing that inflates him up there, I think.
He's like... Karsa was always mechanically insane and could carry games super hard on things like Lee Sin. Like, that's kind of what he was famous for in the past when they always took down SKT on Flash Wolves. And we saw a little bit less of the crazy, mechanically gifted Karsa just when he joined RNG because he still needed to find his spot. But I feel like now this summer split, when I watch him play, like, he's the better jungler of the two between him and MLXG. And I only see MLXG being used if you need that like high risk, high reward kind of surprise. Otherwise, to me, Karsa is just a better option. And he fully deserves to be ranked as the second best jungler at the tournament. I'm almost crying because I love him so much.
Yeah.
Compose yourself, Deficio.
I want to talk a little bit about final thoughts of the list before we do honorable mentions and wrap up the whole show, because these lists every year are so hard to make. You're making your subjective opinion while trying to be as objective as possible, and then we're combining them to get the top 20 list. So what's unique about these lists is it's I don't think you'll find a person who will make their own top 20 list and find exactly the same top 20 list right beside it, right? There are so many things that go into it. Your criteria are going to be slightly different per person. It's one of the reasons I find it so miraculous that we put Kiin and Ruler at 4-5. Like that's to me the most confounding thing about this whole list. But do you guys have any final thoughts about this top 20 list?
My favorite thing about making the list is, like you're kind of alluding to, it really feels like a juggling act with so many balls in the air about meta expectation and previous performance and projected performance and other variables and team success and individual success. And again, we think back to really lauding Longzhu and then them not being able to come together and now having KT and RNG dominate the list. It's a really fun thought exercise where you need the strength of conviction to stick with your guns and have a consistent way to rate players, even when we have QV on the list for peak performance and other players on the aggregate performance.
Yeah,
but
because you're juggling all these different variables.
That's the part that's so fun, and that's the part where when we all saw Kiin at 4, it was like, this is probably going to look bad. That we all came to the individual decision that a player with 1 year of play that a lot of our more casual viewers would not have even heard of or seen play is going to pop off. But that's why, again, we have to be first confident and be ready to eat the humble pie later.
I felt like making the top 10 was not super difficult for me. I actually locked in my top 10 fairly early on. I think, however, making my 15 down to like 25 was insanely hard.
Yeah.
I felt like there were so many players, and it was all depending on criterias, like how much do you value current performance versus historical versus regular season versus how well will this team perform during the tournament. I think there was a lot. I kept moving players in and out, like, you know, not having Spirit on this list will be something where after group stage...
2 junglers.
That's the thing, right? After group stage, we might sit here and go like, yeah, Spirit was basically the best FLICKR player. They got first seed in their group. He should obviously be on the list, right? But because he had so many poor performances during like the regular season, it was actually very hard with him specifically. And then also think with Western players. I always have this argument with myself in terms of individual talent. I rarely feel like the best Western players are much weaker than, let's say, the LCK players, right? Like the difference between a Doublelift and a Ruler, if you just look at pure mechanics, is not that big. It's not like Ruler is just 10 times better than Doublelift, and there will always be a huge difference.
Like your ability to last hit creeps in position in team fights.
Right. There will always be some situation where you will say, okay, Ruler is the better player. Now, I can confidently say that is the case, but there's a lot of Western names where, like Perks, you know, Wonder, you know, Someday, these kind of players where you could argue and say actually individually they will match some of the players on the list already, but they're not on it. And it's always juggling that, like trying to hide your Western bias compared to, you know, what we see from LCK and LPL.
Yeah. Or just bias for any region, trying to eye test an individual player within their regional environment and then projecting that, because this is a year where I am expecting the LPL to project stronger. I think the league improved. So that did bump up LPL players a little bit. And Kiin is just a good poster boy for this example. Like, because he is an LCK top laner who finished second, that gives you more freedom to place him at number 4. If there was a breakout top laner in NA or EU that was a top player in that region,
I mean, Licorice,
he wouldn't be number 4. Like Licorice, probably 30, 35. I didn't project that far down, but I just know Licorice wasn't even in my mind for putting in the top 20.
But I don't think that's a problem. At the end of the day, the top 20 players at Worlds is always going to be emblematic of the regions that are expected to dominate this World. And it does feel like the Eastern regions will dominate once again. And it's one of the things where, with a sustained success of any of these regions, that will force us to reevaluate. So I don't actually see it as an issue, because largely the West does come in as underdogs, as they did on this list when it came to, okay, but just who can make top 20 when we can only get 20? We're not talking about 20 to 30. That will be something that's always a storyline and narrative, but also a reality of ranking, and we'll judge accordingly as time goes on.
And we also know with League of Legends, when it is so focused on the team, and how they perform overall, it is very hard for some players to look good individually if their team is just getting destroyed. And we see that at Worlds, pretty often. And it suddenly looks like 5 players on this all team are just all 5 way better than the other 5, but that's then also a lot based on how well they actually play as a team, how they draft, how they set up advantages in the game. And that's where a lot of the Western players also very quickly can look worse, and you start moving them further away based on historical context of international tournaments.
Yeah. Also, why 20? Like, why did we decide arbitrarily that it was 20 players?
I don't know.
Didn't we inherit 20?
We did inherit 20 from the previous holders of the list
Yes.
when we started doing this in
Do you want to do
2016.
top 30? Top
No,
10?
I don't think so. I think I'm happy with 20.
People that don't know about the origins of the list, it sounds very mysterious, doesn't it? Like, we inherited it from the previous holders.
Yeah, since 2016, we have been doing this format of 3 analysts ranking the top 20 and then combining the lists. Players that I wish I could have had on this list, that Jackie Love is one. I thought he's always a super talented AD carry. I actually did have him barely making the list as my own personal, I believe, number 19. Core JJ is a guy, right? If his AD carry's 5th, trying to divorce the AD carry and support is always tough. There's going to be call-outs for Ning, number 1 LPO jungle by the vote. We talked about inconsistency, though, keeping him off. Even Mako, a guy is a leader of EDG in a lot of different ways. But as we mentioned, like with these criteria and with this list, there's always that hard cutoff where there's guys you wish you could put in that you couldn't.
And here's 2 players I couldn't justify putting on from the LCK that wouldn't even make my top 25, but are players that I wish I could justify, that I can see success in. Haru from Gen.G, if he does actually dominate as the starter, he had an amazing run when he was finally subbed in during the regional gauntlet. And gives a very different dimension because he's a carry jungler compared to Ambition's farming style.
He can
In fact,
gank.
there's great interviews with Edgar when he was asked on the Reddit AMA about what can you say about Ambition and his level. He said he's either the best jungler or the worst, depending on the meta. Haru is the reverse, but has a good relationship with Crown from a year and a half ago that he was trading upon in this gauntlet run. I think that's what also propelled Crown over Fly as their squad player, as Fly is not actually on the 6 at all. The second one is a player who was the superstar of Afrika Freaks in spring, and that was their support Tucson, who we couldn't stop saying great things about his engages, maybe the best Rakan in Korea over the course of the year. He had a very poor summer season that really deflates away the hype, but it's a sort of weird scenario where it can't justify him top 20, and yet if he's the superstar of Afrika Freaks, it's not a surprise, but there was no way to kind of show your work and say, well, of course, he's a top 20 player. This guy is a monster on engage supports. We already talked about Sword Art's meta. It is technically Tucson's meta if you can kind of get over some of the issues that were cropping up in summer.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us on this world's top 20 journey. A lot of people we wish we could have put on this list. The full list is live on lolesports.com. You can also find links for our individual lists. We'll be putting those all out on social media. I know I personally will on Twitter and Instagram. Just full list for anyone to digest. There's Reddit conversations about it. You're going to check back in during Worlds. We'll figure out who wins the Dade Award at the end of it. But it's been fun. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Tarzan is a top 3 jungler in the world. I wish Griffin was here.
He's just not at Worlds.
Yeah.
We all kind of want Griffin to be here.
Yeah. Griffin being here would have been hype.
And yet Gen.G is one of the favorites for this tour.
It would have been another thing that would have moved the list further down. I think if Griffin would have been at Worlds,
We would have been still
There have been
writing the list. We
so
wouldn't be ready
many
for this-
discussions
We
about
wouldn't be ready
like,
for this
all
show.
of
We'd
their
still be
players.
working it out.
It's true.
Anyway, that's it. We're locked for 2018. And that is what people are going to judge us by. So flame all you
Let's
want.
go.
Yeah,
That's
flame
it for
on.
World's Top 20. World's Group Stages starts in a couple of days, and we will see you then.